Hello, everyone. My name is Chris, and I want to thank you all for joining us today, where we'll be going over fueling your competitive advantage with EDR and SOAR. Our presentation today will be given by Chris Barninger, our Senior Solutions Engineer here at Carbon Black, as well as Many Hair, VP of Product at Samplify, our guest speaker. Today, we'll be going over SOC and MSSP challenges, and how we can use security orchestration and streamlining incident response efforts to help address those challenges. Additionally, we'll cover the impact of endpoint detection and response on SOC effectiveness and the advantages that come with combining EDR and SOAR. So with that, I will hand things over to you, Manny.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you very much, Chris. Many are here, the VP of Product for Simplify. I think what I'd like to start talking about is a bit what we're seeing within the MSSP market itself. There you go. It's a little talk about what we see in the market itself, right? And I think what we've seen over the last few years is a greater need for security operation in general, as attacks get more prevalent and all the kind of the changing cyber landscape, as I would say. And that causes enterprises to be more focused on creating their own operations, but also a very large focus on going towards an MSSP service. And as more and more MSSP services come up, we start to see that a lot of the old, what we call commoditized services around the baseline monitoring and looking at the alerts and creating a ticket for the customer and just doing that as a more traditional service, is being something that's now being pushed into some more differentiator making services, right? So how is I, as a managed service provider, to provide additional unique value for my customers? That typically comes from much more what we call emerging services, right? Something that has much more profitability and is much more dedicated to the core knowledge and expertise the MSSP can provide. One of those key ones is MDR services. We see others, right? Like threat intelligence services, UEBA or DLP type services. But as the market grows, we see a lot of managed service providers looking for their differentiator, their uniqueness. And those typically come, or as a large part of them, come from their ability to go beyond just prevention. What happens when the alert comes in? How can we help our customers with our inherent knowledge and expertise to not just know that there's an alert, but what does that mean to them? How can they resolve them and hopefully help with their own detection and response as well? That leads to the whole concept of, we've seen a lot of MDR, right? Where if we used to see a very old concept of device management as a service, where you manage your firewalls and your IPS, and then we found, let's call it the second generation of monitoring. All the logs going to the SIEM. Alert is created, and the MSSP analyst looks at the alert and decides to escalate or open a ticket to the customer to basically take it from there, with a recommendation perhaps. And today, as this becomes much more and more prevalent, it's moving towards the next phase, which is much more of a detection and response phase, where you go beyond just looking at the alert. We go into understanding what the alerts mean for that customer. How can you help them investigate and give them a very good insight of what's going on? And even how can you respond and prevent for them or prevent in the future for them? And I think that's where we see a lot of the MDR services coming in and where we see a lot of use or joint customers with Carbon Black, for example. And I think that's kind of where we see the market going and will continue to go as we see more and more interest coming to us. Before we even talked about some of the, talk about some of the joint benefits here, let's really talk about what the challenges that an MSSP will have today, right? So let's talk about even the more general problem of a normal security operations, right? So I think a typical security operations will always have a little too many alerts that he can actually handle in the right way. He's going to have a problem with staff turnover and hiring a new analyst. He's going to have a problem learning different tools and creating automation to provide a little more efficiency and proper prioritization to his own needs. But then let's shift to the MSSP world, where not only do they have to handle the traditional problems, they have to handle the ability of customers to have different technology sets. They have to actually be able to work for a process to create all the different needed responsibilities across all their customer base, and they don't want to do it without turning away their business. And more even than that, if you look at a traditional enterprise, they look at the SOC a lot of the times as what we call a cost center. They need to buy or pay for specific services to get up to speed and be protected. In an MSSP, that really flipped. For an MSSP, that monitoring center is actually the profit center. Driving efficiency in an MSSP is driving the bottom line of that MSSP. That is why we see a lot of movement in the MSSP world itself toward a tool such as a SOAR. And that to the next step, let's talk a bit about what a SOAR really is, right? So I think a lot of the people who are listening here will have some idea what a SOAR is. And typically the baseline we always hear is about the need for automation. And it's definitely a big part of what a SOAR is, right? So how can we automate different APIs? How can we create a process that uses different tools and doesn't have the analyst really knowing the tool in depth and still being able to leverage it? That is definitely a key part. It's something we really believe in Simplify as well. How can we use automation? How can we build automation with ease? How can we define playbooks that drive consistency across all the customer base, or maybe even a specific process per customer? There's a lot of ways we can talk about that, and we will show that later on in the demo. But we at Simplify really believe in taking the extra steps, talking about not just the automation piece, but the actual workbench, the foundation of a SOC. And that is how we see a SOAR tool. A SOAR tool for Simplify, and that's kind of our entire angle, is around the foundation of a SOC. That is true for an enterprise, but even more so true for an MSSP. That means Simplify is inherently multi-tenant. So multiple customers can come into a single interface, each with their own unique technology sets, but have one single interface that talks about the process of collaboration, managing the tickets, and even using tools, even advanced tools like a Carbon Black that is very, very powerful, and having those capabilities at the fingertips of analysts that might not be as experienced as you would think, and can really infer, understand, and utilize advanced tools like Carbon Black in every single process and do it very successfully and intuitively. And on top of all of those, add the ability to really have the visibility of those processes. What am I doing? Where can I improve? What can I provide? What can I provide further value for my customers? Either be it by just the service itself, to specialized reporting, to a lot of other things we can continue to talk about. And with that, I think I'd like to kind of hand it off to Chris to really talk about some of the EDR sort of thing. But maybe even a step before it, maybe to talk about Simplify just in a high level. First of all, let's talk about Simplify, as we saw before, as the workbench for the SOC. But what I do want to emphasize is our ability to look at data in the contextual view. And you can see some bit on the screen on the right. And that is essentially that Simplify looks at data not just as strings, but as actual information that is modular, right? So if you have a phishing, let's say, email, and you have a recipient email, for Simplify, that will be an entity, something contextual to rely on, and that is the basis on which all of our integration is working with. And we'll see some of that as we kind of move on. The other thing I would say is we definitely have a large focus on enterprise, but also on managed service provider. We service a lot of large MSSPs, tier 1 MSSPs even. We see a large volume of alerts, and we understand the needs and specific requirements an MSSP has, especially as you utilize tools like Carbon Black that Chris will now kind of elaborate on.
So thanks, Manny, for really kind of setting the stage there. And I want to now kind of talk about how Carbon Black works in this construct that Manny has been talking about. So in the construct of a managed security provider providing MDR, or managed detection and response services, as well as a security enterprise that has stood up its own security operations center that really is looking for the most effective way to go about doing that. And that's how Carbon Black fits in. So ultimately, before I speak specifically to this slide, Carbon Black has 3 or 4 main solutions, but the key underlying theme of each one of those solutions is that they're all focused on the endpoint. So running on Windows, Mac, and Linux, servers, desktops, kiosks, ATMs, etc. The core theme there, though, is that we're running on endpoint, and that gives you a very different vantage point. If you think of traditional managed security providers, most often they're focused on the network. They're doing managed firewall, managing perhaps a web gateway information and things like that. And we're taking that now down to the endpoint. There's a couple reasons why that's important, whether this is, again, an enterprise building its own security operations center or a managed security provider who is doing a service such as a managed detection and response. So the first key point is that Carbon Black collects unfiltered endpoint data. And the way we define unfiltered is we're storing data about what's happening on those endpoints, regardless of whether we think that information is interesting or not. Most of our competitors, most security products are actually sort of making decisions about what data to keep and what data to discard. And we think that's a fundamental mistake, because sometimes you're responding to a security incident and you don't always know what's interesting until several days later, or perhaps even many weeks later. And so having collected that unfiltered endpoint data is really critical in order to have that sort of unadulterated data set that you can not only contextualize and get enriched information about that data, but that you can also do proactive threat hunting on. Excellent. So then one thing we do with that data is we then start enriching that data, not only with our first party, Carbon Black, we have a threat research team that's world renowned, but we also reach out to third party threat intelligence feeds and various other sources to take that unfiltered data and to really start to layer on top of that what's interesting about that data. It might be something as simple as a file hash or a file name or an IP address or a pattern of activity, and we collect that data. Once we collect that data, we start to enrich it. And it's once we enrich that data that we're then really able to do some very interesting things. Now, there's also the concept of real-time current state data. And what that really means is, at the end of the day, there's always going to be things that are sitting on the endpoint that we maybe don't, 24/7 proactively collect just because it's usually not an interesting information. But Carbon Black is able to reach out to the endpoint and actually grab that real-time current state data. It could be something as sort of obscure as the value of a particular registry key. We're not going to collect every single value of every single registry key all the time. It would simply be overkill. But in an investigation, sometimes you need that level of granularity. And with Carbon Black, you're able to reach out directly to the endpoint remotely and get that data and pull that back and have that sort of fulfill the query of the investigation. Finally, up until this point, I've really been talking about data and data enrichment and how you can use data to have a more effective security operation, to have a more effective managed security provider, but it also is about remediation and enforcement. So imagine, you're maybe investigating a couple of systems in the environment that you believe are infected. You can actually remotely quarantine or isolate those systems to essentially stop the bleeding, to stop any sort of data exfiltration, to really kind of kick any attackers off the network or off that endpoint, right, and not let them do any further damage. Even if you've isolated or quarantined a machine, though, you can still do things like remotely killing a process that you think may be malicious, right, or blocking files that you don't want to have access to execute any further. And so, again, whether this is a security operations center or a managed security provider that's providing these, very effective remote remediation procedures to your customers, it tends to be very flexible and it really speeds up the remediation aspect. And all of this is built on an open and extensible platform architecture, which is what allows Simplify, right, to take our APIs and to really fold those into its workbench and into its playbooks. Now, going a step further on what we're calling unfiltered data, really, if you think about unfiltered data, again, on an endpoint, Windows, Mac, Linux, that's going to be anything that executes, and then we're keeping track of everything that those executions actually do on the system. So a very simple example, let's say you launch a browser, chrome.exe, browser makes network connections, so we're capturing the IP address, the domain name it resolves to, the port and protocol, is it port 443, is it some random port, is it TCP, is it UDP, all that network connection information is collected. Also, any modifications that are made to the system, file modifications, registry modifications on Windows, cross-process events, which would typically be things such as one process injecting into another process. We see that quite often in malicious attacks. And also, anytime there's a new binary that executes that we don't already have a copy of up in our cloud, we're actually going to pull that up. And the beauty of that is, sometimes something runs in your environment and maybe a few days later you realize that that execution was actually malicious. Well, we've actually captured the binary. So even if the attacker has deleted it since then, and is long gone and has sort of cleaned up the track, so to speak, we still have a copy of that binary, so you can run it in a sandbox, maybe do some reverse engineering on it, malware analysis, and so forth. So unfiltered endpoint data is very critical to what we're doing here and really ties directly into the way that Simplify integrates with Carbon Black. Now, how does this all tie back to MSSP effectiveness? Well, the category that we're really talking about with Carbon Black here is EDR, endpoint detection and response. And so the MSSP flavor of managing EDR is MDR, managed detection and response. And MDR has been really an important aspect, as many talked about in one of the first slides in the presentation here. That really gets an MSSP away from commoditized services. An MSSP is able to basically have an agent on an endpoint that the end user will have no impact from, because it's just a very lightweight EDR agent, and that really helps to first cut investigation time. A very simple example of this is if an MSSP is managing firewall alerts and things of that nature, they can take the information from those firewall alerts and directly correlate it to what Carbon Black is seeing on the endpoint. So maybe there's an interesting IP address. Great, all the firewall's really telling me is that there was a network connection made to this IP address, but Carbon Black can sort of zoom in on that and say, well, okay, but we know that actually came from 4 different computers in the environment, and we can see that the IP address resolved to this domain, and it all came from iexplore.exe. And what else did iexplore.exe do on that system? Oh, it actually wrote a couple of other files, right? And so you can see everything that occurred in kind of a kill chain fashion, and that dramatically reduces investigation time versus just trying to sort of chase down a lead from a firewall or sort of a generic log like that. And that really allows you to reduce overhead and be able to remotely investigate. The unparalleled visibility here is really important, because at the end of the day, as a managed security provider, as a security operations center, the more visibility you have, the faster and more effective you can make decisions. All of this is done at unlimited scale. All of this helps to speed response. And then the last sort of cube there is the ability to do proactive threat hunting. So the concept of just chasing alerts is sort of an older concept. Now there's the ability with this unfiltered data. You may read a new security article that pops up today about a new vector of attack that's never been seen before. Well, with proactive threat hunting and the fact that you have all this unfiltered data from the last, X number of weeks or months, now you can actually go into that data set and say, hey, this is a novel attack, but do we have any data in this environment that actually shows that this attack may have affected us? And thankfully, usually the answer is no, but even just that validation of saying, well, we know that this attack did not happen in our environment, even though it's a novel attack, is very, very effective. So again, really there's been a huge impact of EDR and MSSP effectiveness, and that's been powered in large part by Carbon Black. And Manny, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Chris. We would like to get as deep as we can into the demo, so we try to keep it short on the slides so we can show a bit more of the product. I would like to say a few words on just how both of these products, Simplify and Carbon Black, work together. And I think, especially when referring to MSSPs, the values a lot of the times are in the different stages of what we call handling a case, right? So the initial value we talk about is how we can use both of these together to help provide better visibility, to help better triage, and really do an initial assessment of the alert as it comes in. And all this will be seen inside the demo. I'm just setting the stage a bit. The second one is how can you use all the endpoint data collected in Carbon Black and provide that with ease into the MSSP's analysis process, even if the Carbon Black installation is remote. And we'll see some of that as well. And obviously, by utilizing all the capabilities and functionality, even through the API that Chris mentioned before, how can we use Carbon Black to do really, really deep and insightful automation in the customer's premise to respond to actual threats as they come in real time? And in a higher level, if we want to kind of continue a bit more on the MSSP specifically, to really talk about the bottom line that this can provide to MSSPs, it's the ability to streamline the quality and the ability of your own organization to provide incident response on the customer's premise as part of your own services. How can you add the value of EDR and a SOAR like Simplify to really provide more services as part of your MSSP as an MDR, and even as further things, and we'll talk about that a bit more. And I think what we're looking for is, on top of all of this, for the MSP to be able to manage all of the different instances. Let's say you have 10 different customers. Each one can have their own Carbon Black response instance, but in the interface of the MSSP, all of them will be utilized seamlessly through what Simplify calls a publisher or executive framework, which allows us to control securely and provide data from remote instances as well, such as CB response, and how can you utilize that at ease in the MSSP level. And of course, by the way, in a side note, we connect to basically all this the Carbon Black portfolio, CB defense, CB protection as well. For the sake of this demonstration and overall discussion, we'll focus on CB response as that's one of the more we utilize more frequently. Yeah, so let's start with kind of sharing the screen here. Yeah, do that. Oh, sorry. All right. Can you confirm you can just see my screen before I start?
Looks good, Benny.
Awesome. So let's just begin with some of the high-level information of what we're seeing here. So the first thing I want to cover is to kind of get this off initially is that we're looking at a fully multi-tenant interface, right? So you can see and simplify different environments or MSSP customers, as MSSP will call them, defined in one single interface. You can see multiple. We will focus on Coca-Cola as the tenant we will focus on. But you can see they're already defined as the system is fully multi-tenant and ability to work different environments in a single interface. I would also look at the simplified marketplace to show how you can configure different integrations, in this case, all three of Carbon Black, for any single environment as well. So you can actually see how you can not only run multiple environments, but also see different technologies for any environment, or in this case, different instances of Carbon Black for any environment. You can see how you can configure it over here and be able to test and utilize it with ease. And with that, let's talk a bit about more of kind of the MSSP screen itself, right? So as an MSSP analyst, this will be the case, the screen I work with the most, right? So what you see on the left side, and let's reduce the filter so you can see all the environments in this case. I see on the left side a case list that is being prioritized, clustered from all the environments I am as an analyst currently associated to in one single queue. So as an analyst, I have one queue, all my customers right now, all prioritized and ready to go for me as an analyst to really understand. And you can see the different environments coming in from the different logos here, what we saw just in the screen before, and it's all ready to go for me. And another thing to highlight is the cases in this queue, it hasn't been fully automated because a lot of the cases, we have some MSSP customers that automate a very high percentage of their cases. We know that if I'm an analyst and this is in my queue, it requires further attention from me as an analyst as well. And we do a lot to make sure the analyst can benefit from the automation and work with it intuitively as well. One last thing to highlight is the alerts themselves can come from a variety of places. So it can come from different SIMs. We have an MSSP that can have 5 ArcSight customers and 5 Splunk customers, and still the interface will be the same. Or it can even come from sensors as well. We have customers that have their own Carbon Black instances that feed the alert as well. So not only can you use Carbon Black for the detection and response purpose of handling an alert, but it can also be the source of the alerts themselves. We have MSSPs that basically function on top of Carbon Black and Simplify, and it is very effective and it's been proven to be very powerful in a high level. And with that, let's really talk about what we're seeing here. So let's filter out for the specific customers we want to focus on. In this case, it's called Coca-Cola. And you can see all the cases from Coca-Cola appearing on the left side. And let's look at the different layers we can really achieve from this type of integration. And the first one I would like to show is a very basic login alert, right? And this login alert is essentially, you wouldn't think it's very EDR-centric, but it is still a lot of things you can do just by utilizing the combination we've talked about here. And let's just talk about this alert, and let's talk about the screen we're seeing here. So on the right side, what we've opened up right now is a screen we call the triage screen. It's meant to help analysts in MSSP or enterprise understand the purpose of the case and react to it as quickly as possible. Let's look at what we see here on the screen. So we already see that the alert itself is the auto working hours connection from that specific customer. Again, we're talking about Coca-Cola here. You can see what we talked about before about Simplify's own approach to an alert, right? It has entities and relationships. So what you see on the right side is the actual entities involved in this case, the user, the host name, and the IP associated. And you will talk about some of the markers here and what we can actually infer. But for me, the high level to say here right now is that it's all very contextual. This string, this name of WS-many, that host, for Simplify is an actual object you can drill down on and really look at its contextual object and not just as a string of different type of information you might return from a JSON or an XML, which is much more automation driven terminologies, and we'll see some of those and what that means as well. And what you see on the center part here is what we call the insights pane. So obviously, a lot of the automation has already occurred, and we'll talk about the automation that's already happened here. You see all the green circles. But as an analyst, when I look at the case, immediately in front of me, I see the insights I need to know. And in this case, the insights provide context of the customer's own environment, right? So working through an AD Active Directory on the customer site, I can now infer very quickly, automatically, seamlessly for the analyst, what this user is and what it means for that organization. And again, it's pulled automatically. The analysts don't even have to look for it. It's right there. And I think context for an MSSP is really key in providing high-value services. And a tool such as the directory, but much more like a Carbon Black, can provide those contexts very easily. So even if you don't look at high-end endpoint investigation and response, just the context you can provide, you can see even in a completely different alert, I can now infer the context of that specific host for the environment you're working with for that customer immediately. And you can see an analyst to perceive it very, very immediately, and you can make automation based on this. So if you want to make differently based, if it's a different OS or the domain is different, you can make those automations as well. But the key here is that all the context has been already provided for the analyst, what the user is, what the host is, and I've even taken the liberty as part of the automation to send an email to the actual user here to ask if it was him and act differently based on his response. So again, if the analyst here or the user in the customer environment, in this case, says that he is not aware of this activity, it is probably worth a further escalation, whether he said he probably did it, and then maybe want to close this, and this whole case can be fully automated. And just to talk about the need for a contextual view, and just be able to provide that context immediately. And before I kind of hand it off for Chris for a second to talk about that a bit, I want to look at the visualization screen. So this is a very basic screen in this case, because it's a very simple alert, but you can already see some of the things we've talked about. So as I'm an analyst and I want to drill into the case further, I can see a visual aspect of what just happened in this alert. And you can see the alert themselves, what is coming from the actual underlying SIM here. But you can see the different objects, and you can see the host talked about and the user talked about. And what I mean by context is that I can click on this host and really provide the information about what this host means, right? And get the information about the context that's involved, or what the user means for that specific organization. And all the information is very contextual. So as an analyst, even as a tier 1 analyst, my ability to understand and infer that context is really unique. And Chris, anything you would like to add kind of about what we're seeing on the first level here?
Yeah, definitely, Manny. I think what's really powerful here is the flexibility of the analyst to be able to, sort of the second they start working this case, there's already an enormous amount of context information available to them. And so that allows them to make decisions much faster. And then when they actually start wanting to sort of expand and do different things, you have that flexibility to do, things manually within the context of your console, as well as via automated actions. And from a Carbon Black perspective, one real powerful part of Carbon Black Response is that it's an API first product, which means that even Carbon Black's own console uses its API to do things. So essentially anything you can do in the Carbon Black product directly, you can also do via API, and Simplify has done a very good job exposing all of those actions and queries right here in this in this workbench. So very powerful stuff.
And to completely agree, and I think to add even another layer to demonstrate what you just talked about, let's talk about these manual actions, right? So if I'm an analyst, even if it's a case that's regarded as it's not automated at all, and I look at this host here and I want to take further action, I have the ability to create manual actions based on all the APIs that Carbon Black has to offer. So if I want to get information about this host, run a binary process search, get information about the host, even block a process, kill it, block an IP, isolate a machine, all of it is something I can do even without automation in place. It's all very intuitive, very something an analyst can do very easily, and something we see utilized by our customers to really provide efficiency, but also a lot of contextual understanding to an analyst as they provide better and better service to their own customers. And what I'd like to now go to a bit more complex case. It takes a bit more complex investigative ability here, and this is what we'll call C2 traffic, which is much more of a network-based. It's very similar to some of the use cases that Chris mentioned in his own conversations around how can we use some of the data collected in Carbon Black and bring it into the analyst's own processes intuitively. In this case, it's called RSC connection. So obviously, it's part of an IPS alert detected on a customer site, again, through a SIM in this case. And a lot of the structure of the screen here is the same. We have the top part, which is really about what the alert is for, and if we have multiple alerts, and we'll see that in a bit, how is that clustered together and how does that look? On the right side, you see the actual entity, the contextual object we talked about before, and you already see this IP here is marked red because intelligence source, in this case Threat Connect, has marked it as a malicious IP. So already I have something immediately to infer to the analyst there's something malicious in this case. If I were to go in the playbook, it's a bit more complex here. You can see a lot of the activities that are already been done. But let's talk about what the analyst sees in the insights pane, right? So we have there's an IRC connection from an IP. First thing, we like to ask about what this IP means for my customer immediately. We already see the information here. You know, it's an old Windows XP box. On the right from that, you can also see the ability of taking intelligence. So because we are modeled through entities, and that's, you know, we have an entity of an IP on a host and URL, we are very well matched with tools like threat intelligence platforms. So to infer an observable threat intelligence and be able to match it against our own entities is almost instantaneous. And in this case, you can see the IP and the information Threat Connect has on that specific IP. And already there's a lot of context that come in automatically, and already a lot of automation can be had, including escalating to a customer if needed. But what we've done here as an MSSP, might want to take the extra step, is to really start investigating a bit further. And we start with the most basic idea here, which we look at Carbon Black, and we know there's a specific IP here, a malicious IP that Threat Connect has marked as malicious. And let's look at processes in my organization that are related to that specific IP, or specifically here, processes in the customer's own organization that have communicated with this specific IP. And you can see how you can see that. That information provides the key here for a lot of contextual analysis you can do to really understand and investigate a threat at length on the customer side as well. And this is, of course, only a taste. You can take this in a whole other direction, from asking what each one of these processes did to really extending the investigation further because of Carbon Black's rich APIs. What I wanted to show here is a taste into the ability to investigate and utilize the binary or process search types of Carbon Black into every single alert, and doing this with ease. Chris, anything on this?
Yeah, just briefly, if you look at the red information on the right-hand side, you know, here in just seconds, we're able to see that there were two different host names that called this IP address, both times from a process called taskhost.exe, and you can even see the full command line there in the JSON response. And you know, if any of you have ever done incident response, or you're sort of responding to security alerts, you'll know that one of the most difficult things at the beginning of an investigation is just trying to figure out what even happened on one machine, and then the next question is, you know, how many other systems did that happen to in my environment? And here, with this, you know, deep, you know, unfiltered endpoint data, and the way Simplify is pulling everything together into one case, all those questions, you know, now are a matter of minutes instead of literally days or weeks. So the efficiency that's provided here, and the ability for Simplify to pull all of these, you know, different threads together into one unified view is really, you know, it's very, very effective. And anybody who has spent time, you know, working on these types of issues, I think will recognize that right away.
All right, that's great. What I would like to add right now is that we already saw a very basic investigative use case, but let's go a bit more advanced. And that's something that can seem very advanced to a lot of people, but it's really something that inherently can be part of utilizing a SOAR and EDR. And here what I want to show is an example of almost a hunt scenario based on an alert here. And what we have in this case, and I want to make sure we cover some things, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the screen, but what I do want to show is, in this scenario, we have an alert here that came in, a malware alert. In this case, you see the entities involved in the same way as we saw before. I see a process, in this case, has been fairly complex. And let's review the process here a bit more simply, because this what we're using here is really contextual investigation and hunting scenario based on the alert. And what we've done here is, as part of the alert, obviously get the information about the binary and the information about the host from Carbon Black in the same enrichment scenario we saw before. What we also done here is we have another partner from Semantic Deep Site that provides threat intelligence. So we just give an example from how we can take a hash and provide further information about this hash. So based on any threat intelligence platform you might have, and it takes information and so on, you can now infer from a hash what other IOCs or indicators of compromise are really associated with this hash. So it will show what other IPs are relevant to this specific threat, what other hashes have seen in the wild with this specific hash. And you can see all this context being pulled into the system. And not only is it being pulled to be demonstrated, but we can actually utilize it further. And what we've done here is actually dynamically build a query for Carbon Black. And what it does is essentially look at all the endpoints on the customer side and look for any hash, not necessarily the hash in this alert, but any other hash that is associated with this threat, right? So in this case, there's 10 other hashes that the threat intelligence has pointed me towards. And we automatically use the deep contextual information from threat intelligence to provide a query to Carbon Black to really hunt that threat across the entire enterprise. And you can see that one additional IP has been found to have a hash that is also malicious and associated with this threat. That hash is also be added to the case as another alert. And what I can show is that if I go back to the exploration scheme we saw before, I will see the initial malware alert. So this is the malware alert that we started from. In this case, the hash involved, you can see it red, the file path, the process involved, and the host you began with. But if you actually point through, you can see that the actual automation has added further entities. You can see another IP. And just to understand the depth of this, it means that we have seen an indicator that had threat intelligence associated with this. We found all the contextual indicator relevant from threat intelligence, and then we hunted for those across the customer environment. And all this is ready for the analyst in such an intuitive way that in 2 clicks you can understand what has been seen in the alert, right? That we have 1 and 2 alerts, and what is the new IP that has been hunted with and how it was found. And essentially, just to understand the scope, this is something that's very unique, and utilizing the EDR as Carbon Black with threat intelligence provide a very unique way to do very complex hunting scenarios and bring it to the ease of an analyst as well, to make it more efficient, but also make the analyst not need to know in depth everything around that. Chris, anything to add about this specific scenario?
Yeah, definitely. So, we've focused the sort of demonstration aspect of this on Carbon Black Response, but we may have some individuals on the webinar who are maybe using a different Carbon Black product, such as Carbon Black Defense or Carbon Black Protection. And, as many mentioned earlier, there are integrations with Simplify for all 3 of those. And so here we're looking, for example, where a virus was found, and that was sort of the impetus for this case to be created. That could also be tying into Carbon Black Defense, right? It could be that Carbon Black Defense has seen a virus,
sure.
Right, and sort of triggered an alert or whatnot, and we have similar capabilities then to be able to drive playbooks and automation and so forth across the various Carbon Black products. So just wanted to point that out in case we had any listeners on the line who were using other products with Carbon Black other than Carbon Black Response.
All right, thank you, Chris. I will also add that if you want to take it even a bit step further and look at this in almost an intelligence-driven type of activity, you will see that aside from just being able to investigate, you could also start responding. So what the automation also did here is automatically blocked all URLs or IPs associated with this threat in all the border firewalls of the organization, in this case, Panorama. And you really are able to do a very intelligence-driven activity here where you get information, you utilize the investigation, you found the breadth of the threat, but you also start mitigating it in the future to prevent it from kind of expanding any further. And I just saw this a very good use case to show the depth that Carbon Black can provide when utilized with proper automation. What I wanted to spend is a couple more minutes to talk about, the ability of Simplify to not just be an automation platform, but it really is a case management and collaboration platform as well. So any action you do, either through a manual activity, as we saw before, through an automated playbook, to a note, to evidence you can save, to even tasks you can collaborate with the rest of the team. It's all stored in a single way where you can come back, you can audit this even a year later and show the customer exactly what you did, but also able to generate actual case reports to reflect what you did here and even send this to the customer in a very templated, formatted way. What I also want to talk for a second is how are these playbooks being built? And we spent a lot of time in Simplify to making sure that to build a playbook is not a Python-driven activity. If you're an engineer and you want to extend, we have a very powerful IDE to help you write more integrations, adapt our own. We have an SDK that is full. But if you just want to build a process and maintain it, it's not necessarily a Python activity. And what does that mean? Let's build a playbook very quickly to understand how we can harness tools like Carbon Black. Let's use Carbon Black in this example. I'm defining a new playbook, in this case from the same Coca-Cola environment we saw. I drag a trigger. When do I want this playbook to start? In this case, let's do all, any single alert that comes in, but you can have multiple types here. And now let's talk about how we can actually utilize the information here, right? So let's say I have a host and I want to enrich information about this host from Carbon Black. I would drag that system info here. All I have to do is select the entity I want to enrich. In this case, internal host that I've seen in this case. You can decide whether you want this automatically or manually. You hit save, and that is it. You just, even if it's a remote, if the customer is remote, you've just built an automation that utilizes Carbon Black to provide context and do it in a few clicks. And that context is so inherent that you can use this in further automation very easily as well. So let's say I now want to make an automated decision based on the response provided by Carbon Black. and I can actually drag it here, and I will look for CB response. All the information provided from Carbon Black from the customer site can now be a basis either for an analyst decision or for automated decisions. So if you want to make a decision based on, let's look for something like an OS, and if you see if it's not a server or contains a server, you can make decisions that are contextual in nature and utilize Carbon Black information to do that effectively, either through enrichment, but also as part of the blocking process. So if you want to isolate a machine from the customer's own environment, you can have isolated host. You can actually utilize that information from Carbon Black at ease as well. So you have the ability to utilize Carbon Black at ease in every step of your case management stage, as we call it, triage, response, any process, any stage of that process, and do it with ease without necessarily having to have a Python engineer to really be able to build that playbook and craft it in a customized type of way. And we actually have a full IDE to help you do that if you want to do that as well. For example, this is the actual code we use to provide alerts from Carbon Black, so you can do that as well. But as an analyst, as a SOC trying to manage my processes, I do not need a Python engineer to build and rely on Carbon Black in every single one of my processes as well. And I want to wrap up with 2 minutes around the dashboards in themselves. So we talked about how we can manage an alert end to end, how we can utilize Carbon Black in every step of that way, and how we can build those processes at ease. I also wanted to mention that because we're doing all this process, we can provide unprecedented visibility to the MSSP. Questions such as, what are my case logs currently across all my environments? Right? How many false positives have been seen by a Carbon Black or a CB defense? What are my analytics logs themselves? What is the reduction rate we've done by clustering cases together? Another layer could be, where can I improve? Which alerts are providing me the most false positive rates? Which analysts are taking the longest? Which playbooks or cases are taking me the longest to handle? And I can get the visibility, and all the way down to timing. What is my mean time to response for phishing for customer A versus customer B, or the SLAs that you have met versus not for a specific customer? And all this is very MSSP aware, right? So I can look at this information in the context of all my customers or any specific customer I want, and I'm able to do that on the fly any single time as I define more and more widgets that are multi-tenant aware, as they all are here. And to wrap up, I would just say one more word about everything we've talked about right now was reactive, right? We saw an alert, we reacted to it. But because Carbon Black is so rich and because Simplify has the ability to do jobs, which are automated actions that happen periodically, we can also initiate very complex hunting processes and do proactive services on that same basis as well. So not only are we preventing effectiveness and usability and a higher level of service for MSSPs, we're providing the ability to, on that same platform, create proactive services as well, and utilize all the integration, everything we just talked about in that same manner in a proactive way as well. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up. Let's move on to questions.
Awesome, thanks, Manny. I think you both, you and Chris, did a great job walking us through the platform and really exemplifying all the benefits that MSSPs and SOCs can experience when using this integration. So with that, we will definitely jump into the questions. The first couple questions we got were about the integration. So for example, I have both Samplify and Carbon Black. Is the integration free? How do I get it? Is it something I download? If you guys want to address those questions.
Sure. So I think probably for me, so as a whole perspective, we don't, in Simplify, we don't price or we don't charge for any use of integrations or actual automation. So any integration to Carbon Black for any of our customers is not something we charge for. And I even add that even the use of the automation is not charged for as well. So you can use the Carbon Black automation as far as much as possible, and the charging will be the same. So we definitely encourage use more automations, and we provide all integrations to most of the off-the-shelf products you can see for free.
Awesome. And the next question for both of you, when do you guys recommend automating an action versus having someone perform this manually?
I can take the first stab at that.
Yeah.
So the way I think about this really, first of all, I think it's very important in the context of what system we're talking about. When we're talking about remediating an endpoint, it's very different to do some sort of an automated action against an employee's laptop versus, say, a production server, and keeping in mind that there are times when you're installed on both in a given environment. So I'd say that's number one. First, consider the system that you're talking about, and if it's a critical system, probably I would lean more towards manual actions versus just a sort of an average laptop or whatnot. Then the second thing I would say is it also depends on what you're thinking about automating. So, for example, there's very little risk in shutting down, killing an unknown process that the systems have done threat lookups on, and nobody knows what this process is, and it's doing some weird malicious things. There's not much risk in automatically shutting that down. What there would be risk in, though, more so at least, is in perhaps isolating a system that requires internet access. Again, thinking back to maybe a production server or something along those lines. So that's the way I would think about it. Kind of depends on what it is you're automating, what type of action, and on what type of system. Manny, any other thoughts there?
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head. I think, first of all, I would say that I think a very good portion of our customers do not automate their response activity. That's just the experience we have. And I think, as you rightfully mentioned, this type of automated response decision are typically a risk analysis view, right? So what's more worth it to you, the risk of damaging availability of a specific sensor or any workstation you have, and what that will do to the environment of your own organization, versus the ability to quickly remove and mitigate a threat. And I think those can change, and the analysis of that risk can change depending on what the context of that risk is for you. And I think that is why a lot of the time understanding the context of what the threat or what that specific asset infected here is allows you to help make some of those risk analysis decisions. And I think, again, that's why we see a lot of MSSP looking for context as the first piece of automation they're looking for.
Awesome. And the next question, Chris, I know you kind of touched on this earlier, but someone would like to know, does Cmplify also integrate with other Carbon Black products, including CB Defense?
It does. Yeah, definitely. It does integrate with Carbon Black Defense as well as Carbon Black Protection, and then obviously we focused heavily on Carbon Black Response in the demo. And then generally speaking too, sometimes we get the question, well, how does Cmplify authenticate with Carbon Black during these integrations? How is that authentication secure? And the way that that's done is simply via API keys. So if you log into the Carbon Black Response console or Carbon Black Defense console, you're able to grab a unique API key, and it's that API key that you're putting into Cmplify as well as the URL of your Carbon Black server or cloud instance. And with those two pieces of information, you're then able to make a secure connection between Cmplify and Carbon Black. And if you ever needed to regenerate an API key, maybe an employee has access to it and that employee leaves the company, and you don't want that employee having access to that API key anymore, no problem. You just go in Carbon Black, regenerate the API key, paste that back into your Cmplify integration, and away you go. So it's very easy.
Yeah, and we just add that within Cmplify, these are always completely securely encrypted, so it's not stored in any way that's visible or clear text, and definitely not in a way that even some of the analysts cannot even see it. So there's a lot of ways to secure that within the interface as well.
Thanks, guys. I think we're coming up on our last few questions here. Are there sample playbooks my team can use to get started when building workflows using CB tools?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think I kind of alluded to at the beginning that I think a lot of our perspective in Cmplify is really about how to be a foundation of that SOC. And I think as part of that, we definitely have a marketplace of playbooks where you can, at any time, download a new playbook and try to use that, including ones that they're utilizing Carbon Black Response and other Carbon Black products, to be perfectly candid here, and be able to jumpstart and start using Carbon Black as part of the automation as quickly as possible, in a way that's completely, in some ways, not even engineering feat, just a simple drag and drop operation that is basically already based on some of our own best practices and previous experience.
All right, thanks, Manny. And it looks like that's going to wrap up the webinar for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us again, and thank you everyone who asked questions. Some other related content that you can check out. We have blogs written by both Manny and Chris, security orchestration and SOC support for MSSPs. and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.